Okay, we're at time, so I'm just going to get started with a few welcoming remarks. So at Global Compact Network Denmark, we are really excited to host this webinar today with UNICEF to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Child Rights Business Principles. We are going to be recording today, as you will note when you popped in. The recording has started, and that's for purposes of sharing afterwards, so you know. Yeah, so let's get started. Let me just start off with presenting today's agenda. So I have the honors of welcoming and giving a few words of introduction to the UN Global Compact. Then Sili from UNICEF Denmark will take over and set the context today and introduce the child rights principles. Eric Neumann from UNICEF Geneva will speak about what adopting a child rights lens for businesses look like. Johanna Koch will share insights from Pandora working with this agenda. After Johanna's presentation, there will be an opportunity for discussion and questions. So make sure to bring up any questions you have there. We'll have at least 10, 15, maybe 15 minutes for a good discussion. And also, you're welcome to engage on the chat throughout. We'll do our best to answer any questions or pick up any comments that you may have. And at the end, we'll finish off with a video message from the Assistant Secretary General and the CEO of Global Compact, Sando Jambo. So that's today's agenda. And yeah, that's just to introduce me. I am Lena Westergaard. I'm Head of Programs at UN Global Compact Network Denmark. And I'm going to start off with a few introductions here. So as several participants here today are not members of the UN Global Compact, let me just start off with a few words of introduction for those of you that are not familiar with us. So acknowledging the emerging of multinational firms in larger numbers and greater scale than ever before throughout the 90s, the United Nations Global Compact was envisioned by Kofi Annan in 1999 to really leverage the growing influence of the private sector on society at that time. The UN Global Compact was established in 2000 as a call to companies everywhere to align their operations and strategies with 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Back then, we were looking at just a handful of larger multinational businesses that were like part of the founding fathers of Global Compact. And today we have grown quite a bit. Our ambition is to accelerate and scale the global collective impact of business by upholding the 10 principles and delivering the Sustainable Development Goals through accountable companies and ecosystems that enable change. With more than 16,000 companies and 3,000 non-business signatories based in over 160 countries and 69 local networks, the UN Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, the One Global Compact. And moving on to today's topic, this is just to share with you the 10 principles that the Global Compact is founded on. The children's rights are really an integrated part of our 10 principles here at the Global Compact. So they're tied to Principle 1 on supporting and respecting human rights, Principle 2 on ensuring that businesses are not complicit in the abuse of human rights, and particularly Principle 5, explicitly stating that businesses should uphold the effective abolition of child labor. And so moving on to the next slide. So really the children's rights and business principles that are that have 10 years this year was developing them together with UNICEF and Save the Children was really at the core of the mission of the UN Global Compact. They were the first comprehensive set of principles to guide companies on the full range of actions they can take in the workplace, marketplace, and community to better respect and support children's rights. And with that, I'm going to hand over the reins to Celie Manuel from UNICEF for context and further introduction to our subject. Here's Celie, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Lena, and it's really great to be able to engage with all of you today on children's rights and business principles. We're thrilled really to be celebrating this year the 10th anniversary of the principles. I head up in UNICEF Denmark, specifically our corporate advocacy and engagement agenda. First of all, I want to tell a little bit more about UNICEF as an organization, in case not everyone attending today is fully familiar with us. UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Fund. It was established in 1946 at the UN General Assembly. So it's really the organization that world leaders across the globe have put in place to take care of, advocate for children's rights everywhere. Our mission is basically to achieve the greatest possible impact through advocacy for children's rights and through partnership on programming together with governments, private sector, civil society, communities, and of course our most important stakeholder, the children themselves, everywhere across the world. We work in about 190 countries, and we work on everything under the sun that affects children across their life cycle. So that's in terms of survival of children under 5, obviously also other children, but children under 5, as most of you know, have a higher mortality. It's in all spheres of health and nutrition, all types of educational interventions to make sure that children reach their full potential as civic beings. It's within environmental concerns on water and sanitation, on climate, pollution, and environment more broadly. And it's also on the social services and the legal services that ensure we have appropriate systems in place to safeguard children's rights and really promote their well-being in all aspects of society. And finally, on poverty reduction more generally, and financing for children, public financing, and then as well all of the emergency work that we do in the crises hotspots across the world, both man-made disasters, conflicts that we are currently seeing many of, and also the natural disasters. So UNICEF has a very, very wide range of work, but what we're going to focus on today, obviously, is really the work that we do with the corporate sector. We call this children's rights in business. That's kind of our overline. And the foundational principles for us here are that, of course, children and young people have the same general human rights as adults do, but they also have additional specific rights because of their status as minors and being more vulnerable than adults are. So rights that recognize their special needs, and these are provided for in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which almost every country in the world has signed. So we know, I don't think many people disagree with this fact, that businesses can impact children's rights in many ways. These impacts can be both positive and negative. And they can also happen across the entire value chain of a company's operations. And this is important from the perspective of the recent proposal on the EU corporate sustainability due diligence legislation that we are I'm just going to touch upon in a minute. Not quite yet, sorry, if we just go back one slide. And it is also important because we really are encouraging companies to look across their value chains, but also across the different spheres of influence and responsibility that they have, whether this be in the workplace, in the marketplace, or in the community and environments in which these companies operate and do business. Marketplaces, of course, having changed quite dramatically over the last 20 years, let's say, with a new, not really a new anymore, but kind of an emerging area of focus in children's rights in the digital sphere. So UNICEF basically calls on businesses to prioritize attention to children's rights impacts across its value chains, across its spheres of influence, and determine its responsibilities and also its ability to influence. And this is where I'd like to just associate a couple of words on the EU directive that came out recently. So many of you will know, probably everyone will know, that the EU is proposing legislation on corporate sustainability due diligence, and UNICEF welcomes any initiative to create an enabling legislative environment for responsible business conduct. we are specifically interested in legislation, obviously, that works for children. That's our mandate, and that's what we are put in place to advocate for. And with this in mind, we have directed comments to the EU that the directive really does need to explicitly recognize children, but also other groups in vulnerable and marginalized positions that require special attention within corporate sustainability due diligence. They do have special needs. They're not just little adults, and it is important to consider explicitly. We also believe it's important to expand the scope of the due diligence obligation, which is currently focusing on very large companies, specifically. Very few companies in Denmark would live up to these criteria. We also are aware that there's made mention to specific risk sectors, and this kind of terminology around established business relationships, which is a bit, well, anyway, there's a risk of perverse incentives here. And we really think the most important thing is that the directive be aligned with the UN guiding principles on human rights and business and human rights. We want to make sure that we emphasize rights-based approaches rather than compliance mechanisms for the same reasons. And we present basically in a second these principles that Lena just mentioned as a framework for really staying ahead of hard legislation and enabling businesses to reach their potential for children, rather than just focusing specifically on how to safeguard against human rights abuses. Finally, we think that this directive really does need to be accompanied by a comprehensive package of supporting measures, including implementation guidelines, and also ensure coherence with other policy initiatives. There's quite a lot going on. I just mentioned the emerging kind of digital space and how we engage with children's and other people's, but specifically children's rights in the digital sphere. There are directives on that coming up. There are the reporting standards that are also coming up. And it's a complex environment, but we just need to make sure that there really is coherence across everything, but also this aligning with the guiding principles is something we think is extremely important. So if we could go on, I want to just, before we dive into these 10 children's rights and business principles, I want to just launch a quick poll. This was, hold on, let me get the right one. Here we go. And have some of you answer, or all of you preferably answer, a little bit about your familiarity with the children's rights and business principles. Are they principles that you are familiar with? Are they principles that you've never heard of? Do you use them in your work, etc.? Let's give a few more seconds. All right, I think we will end here. So what we're seeing is an audience that's reasonably familiar with the principles, which is amazing. And that means that I am not going to go into too much depth on really presenting the 10 different principles. You can do that at your leisure for those of you who are not very familiar with them. And we also present resources later on or in the slides where you can get the links to read more about these principles. If we just go on to the next slide, I think the most important thing for us really to say about these is that we present these principles as a starting point for businesses to consider a wider range of actions that they can take to meet these corporate responsibilities in respect and promotion of children's rights. And these work in those 3 spheres that I was talking about, not just as the directive, the EU directive is proposing like a very, very strong focus on the supply side, but really across the workplace, the marketplace, as well as the community and environment in which both children live and companies operate. Eric is going to speak a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but first of all, I really wanted to share with you a video that we just launched basically at the Global Compact's Leaders Summit. I think it was about 10 days ago now. which will show a little bit more about the origins of the children's rights and business principles and really what they stand for much more eloquently than I can present here.
10 years ago, a landmark set of principles was developed.
I welcome the launch of the Children's Rights and Business Principles.
Pre 2 godine UNICEF je pokrenuo akciju sa ciljem da definiše principe koje bi kompanije trebalo da poštuju kada su u pitanju deca i njihova prava.
And when I think about sustainability, it's really about ensuring that we leave this world a better place for the next generation.
Building on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the CRBP were the first comprehensive set of principles to guide companies on the range of actions they can take to respect children's rights in the workplace, marketplace, and community. The CRBP call on companies everywhere and of all sizes to integrate respect for children's rights into their core business activities, from decisions and strategies to business models and wider sustainability efforts. And they can be used by governments to ensure that business policy and regulation creates an environment that builds that respect. Over the past 10 years, the principles have served as an inspiration for many businesses, regardless of their size, sector, or location. Inspiring action in management suites, farms, and factories, and creating change in law, standards, and practice addressing business impact on children. There is much to celebrate, but much more that needs to be done.
And we are talking more and more about intergenerational justice. We are creating a very, very difficult world for our children and their children and grandchildren.
Achieving sustainable change means holistic action by businesses, investors, and policymakers, with children's rights and children's voices at the center. We need businesses and governments everywhere to play their part. Together, we can make the next 10 years a better decade for every child, everywhere.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you to Global Compact Denmark for inviting me here as well. I'm Eric Nyman. I sit in UNICEF Global in our program group leadership team, working on business and children's rights. So the question, of course, is how do you do this? We saw the children's rights and business principles are underpinned by a lot of normative content, etc. But of course, for a company, the interesting part is how do we start this journey? How do we actually go about this? How do we understand our impacts on children's rights, and how do we actually address them? I'm going to briefly talk you through this. There's a lot more we could be talking about here, and we'll be sharing some links to tools and guidance that can serve as a starting point for any business that are seeking to really look into this and understanding their impact on children's rights. If we go to the next slide. This was the graph that Celie showed you. And the outer ring here is, of course, the what. What are children's rights? What I'm going to do here is focus on the middle ring, which is principle 1. Basically, how do you do it? What are companies, how do companies get this integrated into their sustainability processes? So if we zoom in on that a bit, and those of you who are familiar with the UN guided principles, you'll be very familiar with this. Vivian, if we can go to the next slide, please. So, of course, the starting point for any discussion around sustainability topics is policy commitment from the top. This needs to be something that the company really wants to do, and there is a drive and some kind of accountability within the company to actually do this. So once we have that in place, we obviously need to understand what are the company's impacts on children. And this is not as straightforward as it might sound. A lot of companies are very familiar with child labor risk, etc. That's featured in many different kinds of sustainability regimes, including the UN Global Compact framework, of course. But children's rights impacts are a little bit harder to spot. I'll speak a little bit more about this later, but this is an important step because this is really what makes the interventions effective. Of course, once you understand your impact, we need to start taking action, changing some things in the company to make sure that the company impact on children is not negative and the risk is minimized. As you know, within the business world, we do a good job at tracking performance reporting, sustainability reporting, for example. And of course, in cases of violation, there should be protocols for remediation. Those of you who are familiar with the discussions around the the EU mandatory human rights legislative package will know that this is an important part, and of course also for children's rights. And as you see, this starts over again. Usually, this is a journey. This is not something you can get right at the first try and solve all the problems like any other sustainability issue. So this is sort of a circular journey of improvement. Of course, at the center of this is stakeholder engagement, and in particular, hearing the voices of children. We can talk a lot about how you do this, but I think the important thing here is to not forget children as a stakeholder in any of your sustainability or business and human rights work. If we move on then, speak a little bit more about assessing child rights impacts and how do you do that and why is it important? And I'm focusing on this because this really is the starting point of the journey in many ways for companies, understanding what it is that you actually need to focus on. So moving forward then, what kind of assessment should companies do? Now, there's not really a straightforward way to answer this. If your company is already doing human rights impact assessments or different kind of sustainability impact assessments, then make sure that a child rights lens is added to that. Remember, children's rights are not standalone. It's not a standalone sustainability topic. It's highly interrelated with other sustainability topics, primarily things like gender, but also decent work, good digital governance, responsible marketing, etc. So you'll see this lens really adding value to topics that you're probably already focusing on as well, and a lot of the time adding solutions. Now, in some cases, we have seen companies undertake standalone child rights impact assessments on specific products or specific operations that are highly relevant for children, and that's obviously very useful. But don't forget that the child rights lens really needs to be put on all aspects of human rights when we assess impact. Now, part of this is, of course, engaging children as stakeholders. This is typically done through their representatives. It's quite difficult to engage children directly in a meaningful way. So a lot of companies would do this through organizations that are experts in this space, usually civil society organizations or children-led organizations. One thing that you'll find when you start doing this is the more you pull on the thread of children's rights, the more you'll find that a lot of the issues that are related to children's rights are actually connected to deeper societal root causes. For example, child labor is very often connected to poverty. So in order to actually move the needle on some of these issues, even if you're looking at this from a purely company risk perspective, you really need to understand what is it that makes children want to work or want to work, have to work, actually, in the vast majority of cases. So, and this actually is good. Even though this makes the problem more complicated, it's good because it allows the company to actually understand the issue and adapt its solutions to solve the issue rather than to move it along or shift it. And this goes to my final point here, of course. When you look at children's rights impact or add the child rights lens to human rights impact assessment, we're looking at both risks to children and risks to the company. So the double materiality concept. That again, if you're familiar with the work of the EU or the GRI, etc., you'll be very familiar with this. Now, as Celie said, all companies impact children in some ways. That's crystal clear. I've never come across a company that doesn't have any child rights impacts. But in certain cases, this might be a heightened impact or a case for a heightened scrutiny. So for example, if you're operating in context of poverty, humanitarian conflict, disaster, low education rates, etc., this is one, these kinds of operations really need to look at children's rights because there are likely to be quite large child rights impacts there. If you're operating, for example, with a workforce that's largely female, largely sort of low-skilled, young, low-income workforce, then again, the children of those workers are likely going to be impacted by your workplace policies, and quite severely so, either positively or negatively, depending on what your workplace policies are. This might sound like commercial agriculture, this might sound like footwear and garment, etc., and that's where we see these kind of issues. If you're selling products and services to children, or your products and services are actually used by children, for example, a mobile network operator might not have children as customers, but definitely children as users of their products. That's another reason to look at heightened due diligence. And finally, in the community, activities with high impact on communities will have high impact on children. The important thing here is that the impact might be very different because of the fact that children are developing. So, for example, some environmental or pollution might have impact on children, whereas the impact on adults is negligible because of their developed bodies. So this is another way to look at it. Mining is a good example here. Now, if we move on, I'll speak a little bit more to, and you can. I think this is an animated slide, Vivian, so you can just push through it. What do we have for you in terms of helping you do this? Well, the first tool here I want to recommend is the Children's Rights and Impact Assessment. This is old, but it's still very valid, and this is a sort of a checklist of questions that you can ask yourself to understand your child rights impact. We also have developed specific tools for industries. I'm showing two here on the screen, the mobile operators child rights impact assessment and the online safety assessment tool for digital business. These are far more targeted and gives you far more sort of specific information if you're in that space. The final tool there is a mining impact assessment tool on children's rights. There are many more like this, and we also have geographic tools that show you the child rights deprivations typically in countries that will also help you understand a little bit more of the risk profile. Moving swiftly on, because I don't want to take too much time. Maybe just in terms of showing you impact assessment, I didn't want to show you an impact assessment from a company because we'll hear from colleagues from Pandora in a moment. So rather, I thought I'd show you some of the work that UNICEF is doing with sectors. So we have undertaken a number of impact studies just to help sectors understand their impact and have a sort of a starting point for their impact assessment in their specific operation, because this is very helpful. Starting from the full range of children's rights can be quite daunting. So this example is from the footwear and apparel sector in Vietnam. We've done these in Bangladesh for garment and footwear. We've done these in Indonesia for palm oil, etc. But I just wanted to show you a little bit what the findings of these sector-wide impact assessments are. So for footwear and garment, and this is true pretty much for any industry or any business activity that has a large female workforce, you'll find that maternity rights, issues around the workplace breastfeeding or workplace childcare, maternal health and nutrition come on top of the list. These are things that are very much in the company control. And a lot of times, as you know, if you're in this business, the health centers in the factories actually are the main providers of healthcare to a lot of the workforce and their families. So similarly, workplace breastfeeding and enabling that in this kind of setting is sometimes a little bit tricky. And you know, that's why we have focused on developing solutions for these kinds of things. But it really does give a lot of returns for children in terms of better health, etc., but also for parents, less absenteeism, less need to stay home and take care of sick children, because children are not sick as often if they're regularly breastfed. Workplace childcare allows for parents to be parents while they're workers, etc. But you also have a number of other issues here, for example, wages that are critically important for ensuring that the children of the workers are actually able to be taken care of. Child labor is there. Child labor typically comes up as a key consideration for a lot of companies sourcing from countries like Vietnam. It tends to be given maybe more attention than some of the other issues that should go higher on the list. It's a critically important issue for business to deal with, but child labor tends to be further down the supply chain. Doesn't mean that business can't do anything about it, but it's not always a key consideration for businesses in Tier 1. Let's move swiftly on then to just talking about the second part of this, which is the integration, or taking action and actually implementing interventions. I could talk a lot about the different examples we've seen from companies here, but what I chose to do here is to look at an issue that's probably one that most companies will need to look at in some ways, but very few companies are actually looking systematically at this, which is child safeguarding. So child safeguarding refers to basically the set of policies and interventions that companies take to make sure that children are not harmed by direct contact with the company's staff or premises. So if you imagine a store, for example, children will come to the store, they will interact with the staff, they might lose their parents. What does the staff do? How does the staff keep them safe? Some business premises have child care centers in them, big furniture stores that have a place where parents can leave their children and expect them to be safe. Obviously, safeguarding is a primary concern to make sure that these children are safe. But you can also think about this in terms of online, the online presence of the company. How can we make sure that children don't get harmed within that interaction, or in other types of interactions with the company? So I'll give you 3 examples of what companies have done here. We held a closed-door consultation with some companies that we know are doing really good work in the space to better understand what are the issues they're facing and what are the actions they're taking. And I want to highlight three examples for you here. The first company was taking a focus on children in their marketing, really looking at how children are portrayed within their marketing. Are children portrayed as children, or are they being portrayed as something else? Because there is a lot of practices in marketing that portray children as adults or even sexualizes children. So this company really wanted to make sure that children are portrayed respectfully and as children, age appropriately, but also that this isn't used to market to children, right? Because this is something we also know that children are really not, should not be a consumer of marketing, at least not when they're very small. Another example of this was around the employees. So a lot of companies have employees coming into direct contact with children in different ways. And this company had put in a very sophisticated safeguarding screening and training protocol for those kinds of employees that come into contact. And this, of course, has a lot of steps to it. Identify the kind of roles that might come into contact with children, identify what kind of people you want or don't want in those roles, and how do you screen for that. That goes beyond a criminal background check, usually. And then how do you train the staff to make sure that they know what to do when they come into contact with children, potentially in distress, right? Final example here is on safeguarding online. This was a big in a tutoring company that had to move largely online due to COVID, and obviously come into contact with a lot of children and a lot of issues that they need to be prepared to deal with. So here's just a sort of a snapshot of the kind of issues that that companies might consider as part of the children's rights and business principles, in addition to things like child labor, like family-friendly workplace policies, responsible marketing practices, etc. That might be more obvious. So just wanted to show that. Now, I think my time is up, so I am going to hand it back to Lene for our next speaker.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thank you. Thank you for your great presentation. Like, as you said in the beginning, this can be a really daunting task. So I really appreciate your remark on, saying that you can never get this right at the first try, right? It is a process. You have to keep at it. It is an iterative process to do due diligence, as the UN guiding principles foresee. And thanks also for getting into some really tangible examples of steps companies can take. That's greatly appreciated. So thank you, Eric. And moving on to our next presenter, we will be hearing from Johanna Koch, who is Sustainability Manager at Pandora. She will share with us some insights into how Pandora has worked with this agenda within their company. Over to you, Johanna.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. To kick off, thank you, UNICEF and UN Global Compact Denmark for inviting me to speak in this event today, and hopefully giving everyone here some insights on how we at Pandora have sort of approached the topic of children's rights in our business practices. Today, with a particular focus on how we market our products and alluding to some of the topics that Eric just mentioned as well. But maybe to the first slide, great, thank you. So just to paint a picture of what company Pandora is. Our sort of main mission is to give a voice to people's loves. That can be tangible, untangible things, but just sort of, it could be what people are passionate about, what colors they like, or how they style their jewelry to express themselves. Pandora is the world's largest jewelry brand and known by more consumers and crafting more jewelry than any other brand in the industry. And last year, Pandora sold over 102 million pieces of jewelry. We had about 9 million fans on only Instagram as one of the social media platforms we're on. And we had more than 600 million visits in our stores. And those are some quite staggering numbers. So today I am bringing you closer to how Pandora has chosen to work with children's rights beyond child labor. And maybe Vivian, we can go to the second slide. And traditionally, and also in our case, our human rights expert and other sustainability colleagues in my team, sort of worked diligently every day to eliminate child labor from our supply chains. And Pandora is fortunate enough to have most of its production in-house, which somewhat eliminates some of these risks, right? But after our latest human rights impacts assessment, which we conducted in, I think, early 2021, it became quite clear to us that even though child labor is an ever-present risk in our supply chains, there is more predominant sort of rights holder groups and risk factors, namely the children that we impact through the sales of our products. So as I told you before, Pandora reaches millions of customers through its many sales channels and social media platforms every day. And even though Pandora has a clear policy on that we do not sell jewelry to children under the age of 13, it is very hard for us to control the actual recipients of our commercials when we have commercials airing on national television or end up in our social media flow. So what we sort of helped to mitigate this or helped us on this journey is that we created what we call a responsible marketing standard. You guys might be familiar to the concepts or not, but we sort of created a standard to help formalize and clearly stipulate the company's rules and responsibilities when it comes to marketing our products, and especially to children, or we're using children in our creative assets. And to walk you through sort of, cooking down a bit more tangible and how we actually did this is that we took a two-step approach. As you can see on the screen, our responsible marketing standard encompasses different topics related to responsible marketing practices. But one of the most important lenses we had was children's rights and adapting those in the policy. So the first thing we looked at was to sort of, how do we portray children in the campaigns that we create, the message that we send out, and how we reach children? So as I said before, we have established sort of clear guidelines that we do not market our products to children under the age of 13. But we all know here around the table that, children also spanning from the age of 13 and up. So we need to obviously work very, diligently to promote positive social behavior, body images, lifestyle, and attitudes in all creative assets that we produce. And obviously also sort of it was important for us to stipulate out that we don't want to use any type of visual treatment that can cause harm to children, for example, emotional harm or psychological harm. Furthermore, we acknowledge that, in this digital sort of moving space, some of the messaging that we create are also endorsed by third parties. So for example, influencers. So we need to also ensure that the digital content featuring, influencers promoting our products is identified clearly as advertising. That's super important. And also that we should not include marketing communication directed at children in media sort of platforms where the editorial matters is unsuitable for them. So again, we are sort of moving outside the space of where Pandora has full control. So these are not our platforms. But what we are also committed to is then to do proper due diligence on key advertisers and social media platforms in line with our not only responsible marketing standard, but also our human rights policy and supplier code of conduct. Furthermore, adding the last layer to this is, again, going back to the influencer, because that's really where we sort of lose a lot of our own control, is that we have chosen not to use influencers who are under the age of 13 themselves, but also who primary target group are children under the age of 13. I will speak a little bit to some of the challenges with that a little bit later, but just sort of that was the first pillar of the standard and children's rights approach in that. The second pillar that we sort of look to is also how children are sort of respected when we create the campaigns that includes children. As you can see, for example, on the left-hand side on the screen, you know, this is a snapshot for a campaign picture from a Mother's Day campaign. So we do use children in our campaign assets. But we have set sort of very clear guidelines on how to ensure campaign creations or photo shoots involving children that are, you know, on sites are managed in accordance with local legislation. But beyond that, obviously, international best practice and parental guidance supervision. You know, it was also, I sort of recommend everyone to download the standard if you might. You know, there's a lot of details. I understand that there's a lot of different concepts to grasp, but just to sort of finish off, you know, we make very clear to our colleagues who work on site during these, you know, photo shoots and whatnot to make sure that education is not negatively impacted. This is more long-term. But again, that we conduct risk assessments and mitigate identified risk for all engagements with children in these processes. And also that we, you know, alluding a little bit more to the child labor topic, but we should furthermore make sure that activities are not hazardous or carried out at night when a child should normally be in bed. And obviously it should not include, it should also include adequate breaks. So these were some of the sort of tangible things that we have put into the standard, but sort of just to speak a little bit more about the process. And this is, you know, one example of how we have tried to apply children's rights in our broader business agenda beyond child labor. And, you know, when creating our set of principles, we consulted a number of obviously internal stakeholders, but also a number of children's rights experts, and one of them being UNICEF for hosting the event here today. So, and UNICEF was not necessarily helping us to set the direction of the standard, but to provide sort of a second opinion and a critical lens to the work and to work as a representative for the children who were not otherwise able to influence the principles that we put in the standard. And, you know, to be very honest, we are still in a starting phase of this. We are having training being rolled out globally very soon to all marketing staff. Also, we are driving awareness campaigns internally to sort of make sure that everyone is informed about the standard. But, you know, and also one of the bigger pieces of work is also to make sure that the standard is integrated into the principles throughout the campaign development process. But again, there are many pieces we still need to puzzle together, so we're just starting. And, you know, acknowledging again to what I alluded to before is that some of the matters that we have set out to deliver on, such as, for example, not using influencers who primary target group is children under the age of 13, can be quite tricky for us to carry out, to be very honest, especially as we are working very hard to target Gen Zs, you know, the younger audience or consumers out there through specific collections and whatnot. So we are sort of having this constant internal dialogue on how do we actually carry this on out practically. You know, we see this as an ever evolving journey we're on, but the starting point is really to establish our North Star, which is the standard, and aspirations and actions needs to follow. So just to summarize up, I think I'm also running out of time here, but hopefully this gives you guys a good introduction to some concrete things that Pandora is doing on this topic. And, you know, thank you for giving me the time to speak a little bit about our journey. And I encourage you all to look to sort of how you approach children's rights beyond child labor, and, you know, reach out to informed partners such as UNICEF for advice on how to approach this. It's an ever evolving sort of dialogue as well, and we really appreciated having that two-way street and open communication on how to carry this out the best way. And again, sort of reflecting a little bit on what Celia and all of you, Eric, also touched on, you know, we're all sort of living in an increasingly global and digital world. And the borders of where information we share is increasingly, you know, blurred out. We all have a responsibility to control the message we put out there. And and knowing that many of the recipients of the information we send out are in more vulnerable groups and moreover children. And we should all be sort of, taking steps to ensure that, we carry out responsible, empowering and inclusive practices and content. And applying a child's rights lens has indeed brought value to our business and especially our marketing practices. So with that said, I think I leave, you with, I think we have a Q&A going forward, so I'll happy answer a couple of your questions if you have some, but thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Johanna. Thank you. That was really inspirational to hear this very tangible example of how to go about it. And especially with your market presence, very comforting to know the responsible ways that you've gone about this. Very inspiring. Thank you. So now moving on to questions, reflections, anything that you would like to share. We're not that many on the call today, so anyone feel free to unmute yourself, comment or pose a question. Just going to give you a minute, see if anyone's brave. So maybe we should actually start off with a poll to get the discussions going. CD, will you poll that, please? Here we go. Anybody want to start? It's always one way to start a little bit of engagement. Here we go. Let's just keep it up for another 20 seconds. Who has touch points with children? Who in your organization has touch points with children? Wherever in the organization. Okay. So here we go. It looks like it's really spread out across organizations. Okay, so maybe just to jumpstart a discussion, do any of you have advice to share on how to foster engagement throughout your organization to ensure that child rights lens?
I can maybe speak a little bit to how we sort of approach this at Pandora. And, I think that multi-stakeholder engagement is really key here. We sort of made sure that we framed children's rights within also the concept of responsible marketing practices in general. I think that we adapted a couple of different lenses to our standard. The importance of children's rights is very evident among our colleagues, many of them. So I think that it's a super important sort of topic to bring up. And, that's also the sort of the rationale of why we should do this. And I think everyone can agree to that. We engaged with stakeholders in marketing, my team, obviously corporate sustainability, our human rights experts, but spanning all the way from the risk team to the legal team, to the marketeers and the different clusters that we have. So I think that we just started to foster a dialogue. I also think that one of the important aspects was the human rights impact assessment that we did. It's very evident that can sort of, it's a good proof point. You have that on paper and you can sort of share that with the organization. So I think that moving beyond sort of human rights, I think it's great to sort of see, children's rights as an overarching topic that a lot of people can relate to in your organization. So I encourage you to bring that to the table and start the dialogue with various different teams that we also did. So that was just a first reflection on that, but maybe somebody else has another thing to add. I don't know if UNICEF have any recommendations as well.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I'm not going to give you recommendations as such. I think what we've seen is that this is an issue. This is a critical question, and thank you for posing it, Lene. Usually this originates in either the sustainability department or in the sourcing department if there's clear risk sort of in child labor. And I think I completely agree with you, Joanna. I think where we've seen this sort of go places is where you have that evidence piece, that shows what actually are the impacts, where do they relate to the business. Because as you know, I think the poll showed quite well that this can be, the touch points can be really anywhere in the company, and they probably need to be almost everywhere for this to really work. I'll go back to my safeguarding example here as well, where we saw that, you know, initially child safeguarding sat in sustainability, but the moment you start talking about HR and recruitment, etc., you're entering into a very different space where really the professionals in that department need to lead and run. And that means that they need to very well understand what the issues are and how they actually need to be addressed. I mean, very similarly, if you're talking about products, I mean, children's rights, as I think Johanna alluded to as well, is it, you know, every company will have its own types of impacts. If your company is making food, for example, then you might even talk about the formulation of food products. Is this too fatty to sell to children? Is this too high sugar to sell to children? That also brings in the marketing angle and the regulatory compliance angle. So it's sort of, it really can and should land in all places in the company. But of course, a lot of the time this sits on the shoulders of the sustainability department to actually produce that evidence and lead that charge internally. But it can't stay there. I don't think that can be really sustainable.
Yeah, and also one thing that we actually did was to say that the standard that we created should actually be owned by marketing, and that's really to sort of make sure that we fuel this sort of, you know, understanding and knowledge and respect for children's rights in that part of the organization as well. You know, us, the sustainability team, we can only do so much. I think this is about sort of making sure that people are very much aware of that this is an evident, like this is going to, it's here to stay, and we're only becoming, this whole marketing space is becoming more and more complex. So, you know, I think that ask any marketeer, I think that children's rights is not on top of their mind when they create a campaign every day. And I think that that's the journey we're on, to sort of help educate people and help have that lens on. And I think that when you have sort of open up their eyes to this, that this is an actual issue, I think that people are very much recipient, like they are really taking on board, you know, this sort of task to make sure that children's rights are safeguarded. So,
and maybe just to add to that, Johanna, because I just want to bring attention to the link that Nina Volmar shared in the chat, which is Global Child Forum's benchmarking on how businesses are doing in terms of children's rights and business principles. And it's interesting to note, because the results of this benchmarking actually show that those companies that are doing best are actually doing pretty poorly, especially in terms of the marketing and then the product responsibility at part of it. So it just speaks into really thinking across those value chains, right? And really looking at what are the different operational areas of your business that are impacting, and doing that broader assessment than just looking at the supply chains.
Okay, thanks for that. Johanna, do you want to comment to that?
No, not really. I just, you know, again, just repeating myself here maybe, but again, to what Celia just said, you know, it's just at Pandora. I mean, this is a new sort of way of looking at how we market our products. And I think that we have always had good principles, but they haven't really been formalized. And I think that that's just really helpful. We have seen that, at least in our case, that, you know, putting this down on paper and also looking at this from a long term, and sort of it's one thing that we're saying, we're not selling products to children, fine, but, you know, children also between the age of 13 and 18, but beyond that, we don't have full control of where our messaging and where creative content end up. And I think that that's just it's here to stay. So I think we're going to see more of this, but I think that just the sort of how we are monitoring it, or how we are looking at businesses and how they implement it, is not really there just yet. So looking forward to having that as well. But yeah.
Great. So really something that you need to get massaged throughout the organization, and getting that ownership also outside the sustainability department, right? So yeah, super good point. So actually, I think we should move on to our next final point, where we just want to share a few resources with everybody here to know there is a place to go to start off. Celia, do you want to say a few words to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And very few words, to be honest. We're going to share these slides with everyone after the call. There's also another slide with links to even more resources, but really here, you know, some products that really, some toolkits and some guidance on impact assessment on children's rights within sustainability reporting, in policies and codes of conduct. But there are really a host of materials available for different aspects. As Eric mentioned, we also have resources specifically geared towards different sectors, but the ones that we're going to include, there's a separate slide that you won't see right now, but that will come after the webinar, is really more the broader picture. But do feel free to reach out if you're interested in specific areas, and we can discuss more subsequently.
Thank you, Celie. Thanks a lot. All right, so let's just move on to the ending point of the webinar, where we want to share with you a video statement from Assistant Secretary General and the CEO of the Global Compact, Sando Jambo. Let's get this.
Greetings, I'm Sando Jambo, the Assistant Secretary General and CEO of the United Nations Global Compact. Reflecting on the experiences shared today, one key takeaway rings true. Children need champions for their rights to be protected and for their voices to be heard. And they need to be actively involved in decisions that affect them. This is an important message for business leaders and executives everywhere, from large multinational companies to small and medium-sized enterprises. Across the spectrum of children's rights, there's so much more to do. And as long as there's unfinished business implementing the children's rights and business principles for all children, especially the most vulnerable, we cannot afford to hit the pause button. The human rights principles championed by the UN Global Compact state that businesses must respect human rights and ensure that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. This respect for human rights can only be achieved by putting people, especially children, at the center of a risk-based approach. And unless children's rights and children's voices are incorporated into global sustainability efforts, they will fall flat. The next 8 years will be critical in terms of ensuring that children's rights are routinely integrated within responsible business conduct and the private sector's response to global sustainability challenges. From climate change to gender inequality, decent work deficits, poverty and inequality, businesses, governments, and investors must take comprehensive action. Now more than ever, the children's rights and business principles can guide companies to make ambitious commitments and to accelerate action on children's rights within global supply chains as well as their own operations. The level of leadership and commitment displayed here today is a strong indication that we can confront our toughest challenges together, guided by the children's rights and business principles and the promise that they hold. A world that is fit for children is a world that is fit for all of us. Thank you.
And those were the finishing words from Sando Jambo. And finishing off, I also want to thank all our speakers today. Thank you all for logging on. We will be recording this, so we will be sharing it with a wider audience after. Before everybody logs off, I'd like to ask if anyone would like to share like one key takeaway from today's webinar in the chat. Just type like what is your one key takeaway from the webinar today? And anyone brave enough to start off? Thank you, Celie. Let's start the journey together. Good point. Yeah, children's rights is at many levels. Trine Stephenson says, absolutely right. It sure is. And really can take on various faces depending on how you look into an organization. All companies impact children in some way. They certainly do. It's really all about awareness. Share best practices on creating internal buy-in. Yes. Lilia from UNICEF Denmark, thank you for that. Okay. Thank you. Unless nobody else is typing, it doesn't look like it. We're at time, 11:30, and I want to thank everyone today again. It was a pleasure. We were really excited and honored that we were able to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Child Rights Business Principles today, together with UNICEF. Thanks so much, and thank you, Pandora, so much for sharing your insights and your practices. We really appreciate it. Thank you
for having us.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank
And a good
you.
weekend.